Japanese sentries saw him first, a silhouette half hidden in mist and reeds, dragging himself from the riverbank like something half drowned. Alone, drenched in sweat, and wrapped in a Soviet officer's uniform, he crossed the Amur River into Japanese-held Manchuria in 1938 with a briefcase clutched in his hands. The Japanese were on him in seconds, rifles raised, shouting commands he couldn't understand. Then someone cracked the case open, and soon the chain of command was alive with orders, alarms, and whispered disbelief. What they saw inside pointed to a patch of earth no one had heard of, a place hiding a secret that would end up rewriting the history of World War II. In 1905, the world watched in disbelief as Japan pulled off the unthinkable. The island nation defeated the Russian Empire, gravely injuring their military pride, as well as the very idea of who was supposed to win wars. Western powers, confident in their racial and colonial superiority, had assumed Japan would crumble easily under their thumbs. Instead, the Japanese sank the Tsar's Baltic fleet in the Battle of Tsushima and seized the strategic Port Arthur from under their noses. Russia had been cornered into a humiliating peace. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had crushed a major European empire in open war. The myth of Western invincibility was shattered instantly. The victory validated Japan's emergence as a modern military power. It also fed the rising nationalist sentiment brewing inside its borders. Russia felt the blow of defeat on a personal level, scarring them deep enough to affect how they treated the entire world for decades to come. The battlefield redrew maps and planted the seeds of future conflict. To assert its hold on the region, Tsarist Russia built the Chinese Eastern Railway, a steel lifeline linking its far eastern outposts to its industrial core. It was more than just trains and track. It was a symbol of how far the empire was willing to stretch. One branch, later called the South Manchuria Railway, led directly across Chinese land, setting the stage for conflict that wouldn't stay on paper. The Russo-Japanese War had been fought in part over control of this line. So too was the Mukden incident of 1931, where Japan staged an explosion near the railway and used it as justification to seize Manchuria, establishing the puppet regime of Manchukuo. The world watched. Few intervened. By 1938, Manchuria had become a militarized nightmare. The Kwantung Army, established by Japan to maintain order, ruled the state within a state with an iron fist. They answered to no one, not even Tokyo. They had grown brash, restless, high on their own might, willing to push the limits of their own reach and unafraid to provoke conflict, even if it meant inciting the anger of the neighboring Russia. Meanwhile, across the line, the Soviet Far East had been slowly hollowed out from the inside. Stalin's continuous purges were carving the very guts of his Red Army. Veterans were being shot or vanished, replaced by men who were more capable of saluting than strategizing. Entire chains of command were held together by fear. What was left behind wasn't an army ready for war. It was a disaster waiting to happen. These were two sizable powers, both armed and paranoid, staring at each other. Russian Lieutenant General Grigory Stern was a rising star in the Soviet military in 1928. A veteran of the Russian Civil War, he was renowned for his strategic acumen and rapid advancement through the ranks, as well as being an early supporter of mechanized warfare. He had been tasked with surveying terrain above Lake Khasan with a sharp, tactical eye. The hills before him were deceptively unremarkable, rocky ridges dotted with sparse scrub, barely rising above the marshy basin below. The lake itself was shallow and reed-choked, its dull, iron-gray waters a far cry from any strategic prize on paper. Yet this overlooked patch of earth sat at a critical crossroads, the southern extremity of the Soviet Union, where Russian territory met Japanese-controlled Manchuria and the rugged borders of the Korean peninsula. Stern understood the stakes. To the east, the Trans-Siberian Railway and its southern branch, the Chinese Eastern Railway, threaded vital supply lines to Vladivostok, the Soviet Far East principal naval base and gateway to the Pacific. Control of these routes meant the difference between holding the region and losing it. To the south, the jagged mountains of Korea formed a natural barrier. Beyond them loomed a restless Japan, its Kwantung Army emboldened by recent expansions and provocations. Though the hills offered little in terms of natural cover, Their heights granted surveillance over key approaches and rail lines. For Stalin's generals, these slopes were more than just ground. They were the thin line between containment and invasion. The lingering wounds of previous conflicts, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, and the ongoing tension over Manchuria hung over the region like a dark cloud, fueling mistrust and aggressive posturing. In Stern's mind, every ridge, every muddy trench was a potential flashpoint. This quiet border was a pressure point. Here, where Stalin's Soviet Union clashed with Japan's expanding empire, ideology and ambition collided. Stalin's Great Purge had decimated the Red Army's leadership. It's estimated that at least 100,000 party members were either imprisoned or executed. Everyone was a potential target. Senior officers were removed en masse, and their replacements were inexperienced and fearful, often lacking in tactical competence. Officially, Genrikh Lyushkov was a general in the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Unofficially, he was already a ghost. The purges had reached his doorstep. He'd signed off on executions, sent comrades to vanish into prison trains and pits. Now, whispers circled back to him. At first, the signs were subtle. Reports often disappeared from his desk. Conversations rushed as he entered the room. Colleagues who once spoke freely began choosing their words like they were signing confessions. Then came the replacements. Officials reassigned or arrested without warning, including 2 of Lyushkov's immediate predecessors. Rumors spread that his own file had been sent to Moscow. And in Stalin's USSR, when your name reached the capital, it rarely returned with good news. He saw the pattern clearly. Instead of waiting for the knock at the door, Lyushkov acted. He made quiet arrangements. He smuggled his wife and daughter out of sight, hoping to buy time, but Stalin's net was wide. His wife was captured and imprisoned, vanishing into the shadows of Soviet prisons and labor camps. His daughter was taken up by relatives during the commotion. The regime had taken everything that tied him to the country he'd once served. And so, with nothing left to lose, he fled. On June 13, 1938, under a pale sky near the Korean border, Lyushkov crossed into Japanese-occupied Manchukuo. He didn't run. He delivered himself calmly, with a portfolio of ruin containing troop deployments, NKVD operations, and worse, the extent of Stalin's purge. Entire maps of Soviet weakness unrolled before stunned Japanese officers. Tokyo welcomed him with open arms. Intelligence officers swarmed. The Kwantung Army listened closely, especially to what Lyushkov said about Changkufeng and Lake Khasan. The Red Army, he told them, was hollow. If the Japanese struck now, the Soviets might not even respond fast enough to fight back. Back in Moscow, Stalin received the news with fury and dread. The highest-ranking NKVD officer to ever defect had done so publicly, loudly, and with enough classified material to unravel the Eastern Front. Lyushkov hadn't just crossed the line. He erased it. Tensions crept in, like frost under a locked door, in the first week of July 1938. On the 6th, Japanese codebreakers intercepted a message. The Soviet commander in Poziet had sent word to headquarters in Khabarovsk, requesting permission to secure high ground west of the lake, most notably Changkufeng Heights. The logic was sound. Whoever held that ridge could peer into Manchuria and the Korean port of Raijin. Critical supply railways snaked through the valley below, tying Japan's conquest together like arteries. From the top of Changkufeng, the Soviets could see everything. And in the upcoming war, visibility meant leverage. Within days, Soviet border troops began creeping forward. They dug shallow trenches, ran telephone wires, set up a single heavy machine gun. Official paperwork framed it as a cautious response to Japanese activity, but that was all just a front, created personally by Mikhail Franovsky, the brutal second-in-command of the NKVD. He needed deniability, so the request was pushed through local channels as if it had come from Colonel Grebenik. Even so, the urgency was real. Reports claimed the Japanese were already advancing up the western slopes of the ridge, and that was all the justification they needed. By July 9th, a small Soviet detachment had fortified Zaozernaya Hill, located west of Lake Khasan. 10 men held it for the time being. 30 more were on the way. Barbed wire snaked across the slopes. Landmines were buried. Trenches were carved into rock like scars. Soviet engineers worked through the night, laying traps in what they insisted was Soviet soil. The Japanese saw more than fortifications. They saw a line being crossed. At first, the Japanese-Korean army seemed content to watch them from a distance. However, the Kwantung army grew suspicious. They pressured their allies in Korea to escalate. Within a week, a formal protest had been issued to the Kremlin, accusing the Soviets of violating the border. Russian diplomats denied everything. By July 15th, trench work on the heights was nearly complete. Gravetink reported that 80% of the defensive work had been finished, and rock barriers were halfway done. That same day, Vrinovsky himself arrived at the front. He claimed to be investigating the recent defection of Lyushkov, but few believed him. Vrinovsky's inspection was a show of power, as well as a provocation. He brought with him a small group of officers, among them a young sharpshooter, Lieutenant Vasily Venevtin. On Vrinovsky's orders, several men crossed the borderline knowingly. They began digging in, faking construction work inside territory clearly claimed by the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. The Japanese patrol approached. The soldiers were cautious, respectful. They didn't fire. They simply asked the Soviets to stop. Vrinovsky gave the word. One shot cracked the silence. Venevtin raised his rifle and fired a bullet directly into the head of the Japanese gendarme. The man dropped instantly. Just like that, the heights of Changkufeng were no longer silent. The protest cables from Tokyo turned sharper. The Kremlin's denials grew colder. Along the ragged border, the tension thickened into something volatile. And at the center of this tightening coil stood a man already running out of time. Marshal Vasily Blyucher was no stranger to war. Once hailed as one of the Red Army's finest commanders and a decorated hero of the Russian Civil War, he now found himself marooned in a bleak corner of the Soviet Far East. The land he oversaw was vast and underdeveloped, stretched thin by geography and isolated by weather. Supplies were short, infrastructure was primitive, radios crackled with static more often than orders. In a crisis, reinforcements could take days to arrive. And yet, Blyucher's greatest enemy wasn't on the other side of any border. It was behind his back. The Soviet state expected strength, but Blyucher was given orders under the menace of a pistol already aimed at his spine. So when NKVD border troops began reinforcing the frontier near the Changkufeng Heights in late July, they did so under Blyucher's fractured authority. Although he may not have initiated the first move, he was responsible for what happened next. It was under his watch that Soviet forces expanded their positions, digging trenches, laying wire, and moving men onto disputed high ground. What was meant to be a show of control quickly became a provocation. On July 29, 1938, tensions blew open. Japanese forces, acting under the authority of the Kwantung Army, accused the Soviets of violating territorial lines near Bizhmianaya Hill, a patch of elevated ground with little value on paper. The accusation came laced with intent. Hours later, without waiting for Tokyo's approval, they launched an attack. Their target, a tiny Soviet outpost manned by just 11 border guards. The defenders had little more than rifles, a few crates of ammunition, and the raw instinct to survive. No machine guns, no artillery, no reinforcements coming over the horizon. Just dirt-filled trenches and the wind at their backs. The first mortar shells landed in sharp, rhythmic bursts. Earth erupted around the outpost. Shrapnel sliced through sandbags and skin alike. The ground shook. Smoke rolled over the hill like a tide. Before the Soviets' ears stopped ringing, the Japanese infantry surged forward. Dozens of silhouettes cut through the haze, bayonets flashing, uniforms soaked with sweat, eyes locked on the prize. Despite it all, the defenders held firm. The Soviets fought from shallow foxholes, crouched behind scattered rocks, returning fire through a storm of dust and steel. Their rifles barked, slow and steady. They dropped attackers at close range. Bodies fell, but the line didn't break. Not yet. Bullets snapped past ears. Grenades thudded into the mud. Screams cut through the roar of battle. Smoke turned the hill into a furnace. Even though the outpost held, the tide was too great, and Bezmianaya was already slipping from Soviet hands. Russia, however, had no intention to surrender. Word of the attack spread up the chain of command like wildfire. Within hours, reinforcements scrambled from nearby positions. Trucks roared down muddy tracks. Artillery rolled into the range. By the end of the first day, it was no longer a skirmish. By the second, entire divisions were on the move. In the early hours of July 31st, the hills erupted. The 1st Battalion of Japan's 75th Infantry Regiment surged forward under the cover of darkness, aiming for the 150-meter ridgeline of Changkefeng. The Soviets had fortified their position, but night steals seconds, and seconds win battles. Shadows tore into trenches as Japanese infantry drove into the Soviet line with brutal precision. There was no room for orders or formations, just violence in the mud and smoke. Hand to hand, man to man, the ridge turned into an abattoir. Overwhelmed, the Soviet defenders broke. They fled in disarray, leaving the hill to the enemy. For Japanese tacticians, it was a textbook operation, a perfect night assault that was sudden, devastating, and with surgical precision. It became a model, etched into their arsenal, the proof that darkness was their ally. Still, the moment didn't last. Back in Moscow, the reaction was immediate. Paranoia had become doctrine, and another humiliation by the Japanese would be intolerable. The fact that the Soviets were in no condition for war mattered very little. The orders came down. The Japanese opposition must be eliminated. The newly formed 39th Rifle Corps was thrown immediately into the meat grinder. Most of its men had never seen combat. Their training was incomplete, but their orders were clear. They were to retake the hills, no matter the cost. The Soviet counterattack began prematurely on August 2nd and 3rd, before all units were even in place. The Japanese had entrenched themselves deeply, fortifying their positions with machine guns, artillery, and interlocking fields of fire. The Soviet infantry, lacking cover, walked into a storm. Aid stations were deliberately targeted. Medics crawled into no man's land, dragging the wounded by their collars. Shells cratered the earth so deeply that stretcher teams were forced to abandon paths and slide bodies into trenches however they could. Into this chaos-stained disaster stepped Grigory Stern. He wasn't there simply to observe. He was the man tasked with untangling a military disaster in motion. Stalin had dispatched him with orders to take control of the crumbling situation, quietly if possible. Amongst the stiff resistance and heavy losses, Stern was meant to bring discipline to the chaos. With Marshal Blucher still the nominal commander, it was Stern who pulled the reins. He reorganized battered units, coordinated reinforcements, and reasserted control over the frontline strategy. Where others hesitated, he pushed forward. The 32nd and 40th Rifle Divisions, backed by tanks from the 2nd Mechanized Brigade, stormed the ridge. This time, the Soviets didn't scatter. They surged. Stern's command gave the chaos shape. They exploited every weakness. Where the Japanese line sagged, the Red Army pressed on. Where they broke, the Soviets drove deep. By nightfall, the balance had shifted. Japan's victory, like the night, had been brief. The Japanese turned desperation into a weapon. Armed with little more than Molotov cocktails, bayonets, and sheer will, soldiers hurled themselves at Soviet tanks with reckless abandon. Flames burst all around as bottles shattered against armor, igniting fuel tanks in fiery blasts. Men threw themselves under tank tracks, disabling machines at dangerously close range. One unit, nearly wiped out, mounted a desperate nighttime charge that reportedly broke through a Soviet position. To the Japanese high command, these brutal acts were a perverse badge of honor, a twisted proof that fighting spirit could overcome steel and firepower. The consequences were swift and brutal, pushing Russia to escalate the conflict. On August 6th, a full-scale Soviet assault thundered across the heights. Artillery batteries roared, pounding enemies into rubble. Waves of tanks rolled forward, clanking over shell craters and through shredded wire. The Japanese fought fiercely, refusing to yield, but they were outgunned and overwhelmed. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. On August 10th, Japan was ready to talk. Ambassador Mamoru Shigemitsu reached out, seeking a way to end the carnage. Tokyo had seen enough. The Soviet grip on the heights held firm, and the Kwantung Army, battered and humiliated, could push no further. However, pride mattered, so the language was carefully chosen. Japan wasn't surrendering, only acknowledging that the incident had reached what they called, quote, an honorable conclusion. It was a face-saving diplomatic move for a war they hadn't expected to lose. At 1:30 p.m. the next day, the fighting stopped. The Japanese pulled back. Soviet forces reoccupied the heights they had bled for. The battlefield fell silent. In the wake of the Lake Khasan battle, as the smoke cleared and Soviet troops stood tattered and victorious, Blyukher was allowed to bask briefly in the illusion of redemption. He'd returned to the Far East to lead one final campaign, his reputation supposedly intact. But it was already too late. The bullet meant for him had simply not yet been fired. He would soon be charged with espionage, for Japan no less. A bitter irony, given the blood he'd just spilled to drive them back. The accusation, while not unique, was fashionable, convenient, expected. Stern's victory also came with a shadow attached. Though he delivered results, his rise had made enemies in Moscow. Less than 2 years later, the same system he had defended would turn on him. Arrested during Stalin's final purges, he was executed in 1941. The Soviets had paid dearly for their ground. Nearly 800 soldiers lost their lives, and over 3,200 more were wounded. A staggering 18% of the people lost were officers, a sign of how exposed leadership had become on the chaotic front lines. Some had led from the front in desperate charges. Others had simply been too inexperienced to avoid costly mistakes. Leadership under Stalin was already a dangerous occupation. The battlefield made it lethal. Bullets and shells weren't the only threat. Disease moved through the camps like a second enemy. With bad sanitation and overcrowded tents, dysentery hit fast. Coughs turned into infections. Malaria, catarrh, and fever wore men down until they could barely stand, let alone fight. Medical staff did what they could with limited supplies, working in makeshift hospitals and under constant stress. Over half of all non-combat casualties could be traced back to unclean water, bad rations, and exhaustion. Even among the wounded who made it off the battlefield, survival was not guaranteed. More than 2% succumbed later in hospitals, their bodies broken beyond repair. On paper, the Japanese lost fewer men than the Soviets. Their casualty numbers looked lighter, at least by the math. Still, the impact hit just as hard. Soviet losses were cold and bureaucratic, names on a list. The Japanese came back from the fight carrying something deeper, scars etched into their psyche. The reality was that their infantry confronted the relentless fury of Soviet artillery and armor, standing firm far longer than anyone expected. They'd been tested on more than their strength. The battle had marked their resolve and dignity in ways that no tally could capture. For the Japanese, the Battle of Lake Khasan wasn't a conclusion, it was a prelude. Just months later, in May 1939, another border flare-up would erupt. This time, near the dry riverbeds of Nomanan, further west along the Mongolian-Manchurian frontier. There, the Kwantung Army clashed once more with Soviet forces after a Mongolian patrol crossed into disputed territory. This time, the scale was far greater. Japan committed its 23rd Infantry Division and 70 armored vehicles to the cause. The Soviets responded in kind, but having thoroughly learned their lesson. Armored cars surged into the field. Soviet planning was still imperfect. Many attacks were conducted without infantry coordination. Despite this, sheer force carried significant weight. At first, the Japanese held, repeating their extreme tactics of resistance. They turned themselves into human mines, strapping explosives to their bodies and hurling themselves at Soviet armor. Then momentum shifted, and with it, history. General Georgy Zhukov arrived on the steppe like a thunderclap. Cold-eyed, methodical, and relentless. He brought with him more than reinforcements. He brought doctrine. In late August 1939, with Soviet and Mongolian forces battered but not broken, Zhukov executed what would become a signature maneuver, a Soviet-style blitzkrieg. While the Japanese forces dug along the Khalkhin-Gol riverbank, Zhukov encircled them. Armor surged on both flanks. Artillery roared. Bombers blackened the sky. The Soviet trap snapped shut. In days, Japan's 23rd Infantry Division was annihilated. 17,000 men were gone, burned, bled, or crushed under tank treads. The Soviets lost 10,000, but they won something far more lasting: Japan's fear. And then, without fanfare, it ended. A ceasefire was negotiated. The Soviets held their ground yet again. Japan absorbed the blow and kept its humiliation hidden beneath layers of silence. Japan had already been burned twice, at Lake Khasan and again at Nomanan. Both times, their forces ran headfirst into Soviet firepower and got torn apart. The idea that the Kwantung Army was unbeatable didn't hold up anymore. So when Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, it seemed like the perfect moment for Japan to strike from the east and finish the job. But Tokyo held back. The sting of those earlier defeats, Mongolian dust in their lungs, Khasan mud on their boots, wasn't easy to forget. They remembered Zhukov. They remembered the graves. So they turned south. Instead of Siberia, they looked to the Pacific, to oil, to building an empire, to Pearl Harbor. By striking the United States, Japan woke a sleeping giant and ensured its own destruction. Meanwhile, Stalin, confident the Japanese wouldn't return, stripped Siberia of its best troops, seasoned in snow and battle, and sent them west to defend Moscow. In December 1941, as Hitler's forces closed in, those Siberian divisions arrived just in time to counterattack through the blizzard and halt the German advance. Half a world away, on the other side of the ocean, Japanese carrier fleets were already slicing toward Hawaii. At dawn on December 7th, they launched a surprise assault on Pearl Harbor, plunging the United States into war. It's easy to dismiss a forgotten border clash, a fight over nameless hills buried in the margins of a map. But the course of history shifted on those windswept slopes at Lake Khasan.